If you're a maintenance supervisor for a commercial property, you've had to deal with everything from leaky faucets to flickering light bulbs. But nothing's worse than that ancient boiler that's lived in the building since the day it was built, 50 years ago. It's enough to make anyone lose their cool. That's where Grainger comes in. With industrial-grade products and dependable fast delivery, Grainger can help with any challenge, from worn-out components to everyday necessities. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Happy holidays. Want to give your host a gift? Consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing the show this holiday season. It really helps the show grow. From all of us at Believe, have a Merry Christmas, everyone, and a happy holiday.
Hello, and welcome to Around the Political World with John Rothman. I am your host, John Rothman. If you're a fan of the show, make sure to hit the follow button on the top right of Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening at this very moment. When you hit follow, leave a review or share an episode with a friend. It helps other people discover the show, keeps us going, and as I like to point out each and every day, it expands our base, which, of course, is very important. I thought very seriously, as I do every morning, about what it is that I want to discuss with you today. So let me explain that we are going to talk about news, and particularly CBS News, and the importance of news. And let me explain why. I will, in just a few weeks, begin teaching a course at the Fromm Institute at the University of San Francisco on Edward R. Murrow and his career in broadcast journalism. It was Edward R. Murrow and his crew who in 1938, in the midst of the Munich crisis, defined the idea of a world news roundup, correspondents speaking from various points in Europe, from Austria, from Berlin, from London, and putting it all together, being able to describe an event. And although I was not alive then, and most of you were not alive then, it took off as a concept. And I grew up, to be very honest with you, listening to the World News Roundup on CBS Radio, and what I've become absolutely enamored of is the Weekend Roundup by CBS. Much to my shock and horror, both of those broadcasts have been canceled. There will be no more CBS News World Roundup on the radio, no more CBS Weekend Review on the radio. Those two programs died this week. And so I want to discuss with you where we are in terms of news. And of course, those of us who listen to 60 Minutes know that last night, 60 Minutes pulled a program as part of its segment dealing with the crisis with the Trump administration and immigration, and yes, our relations dealing with a prison in Central America. The decision to pull that report was, to me, another indication of a real problem with CBS. And that takes me a step further. As all of you know, there is a battle for control of CBS. It is part of the broader battle. Larry Ellison and his son are attempting a takeover, as you know, and there is a battle taking place over who will control that empire. Well, let's be clear. If Larry Ellison takes over CBS, you can imagine what the result would be. By the way, it's Larry Ellison and his son, who are big Trump supporters. And if they were to take over CBS, what would that do to CBS News? Oh, and wait a minute. It's not just CBS, it's CNN as well. There is a simple truth. We get our news primarily from the sources of the major networks: CBS, CNN, Fox, NBC, ABC, NBC. And what we have seen in recent days is an assault on the ability for those news organizations to produce information. I am very often asked, John, what do you watch? What do you listen to? And I will tell you, I am addicted to the CBS hourly news. Yep, you turn on the radio. Here in San Francisco, it's 7:40 a.m. You turn it on at the top of every hour, and you get a summary of what's happening in the news. What happens when there's a distortion? And let me give you the best example I can. I have often used the example of Fox News, and I have said that to say Fox and news in the same breath is an oxymoron, because what you get on Fox is not news. And I can tell you, I listen regularly to all the outlets to try to get a sense of where we're going. What I do know is that the chair of the FCC is waging a relentless war against Donald Trump's perceived enemies. That means that the FCC will threaten, if they disagree with what you've done, to pull your license. And indeed, we have seen ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN all bow because they are threatened with having their license pulled. And last week, the chair of the FCC made the statement that the FCC is not an independent agency. So I went back and looked at the law. And the law is very clear. The FCC is an independent agency. One wonders what it would mean if all of a sudden the government controlled our news outlets. What would happen if Mr. Carr's position on the whole question of news and information were to be adopted? What would happen if the threats against the media were to be fulfilled? Can you imagine what Edward R. Murrow or what Walter Cronkite would have said? Indeed, working as I have for more than 3 decades in the business of radio, when I was on KGO 810 AM, there were awards given to KGO, including the Edward R. Murrow Award for broadcast journalism excellence. And it amused me when at one point a young intern asked me, who was Edward R. Murrow? And I was dumbfounded, not because they didn't know, but because the legacy of great news people is forgotten. Many of us grew up listening and watching the most trusted man in America, Walter Cronkite. Well, Cronkite has not been on the air for many, many years, decades, in fact. He went off the air on CBS, that is, as the anchor for the CBS Evening News, in 1981. So stop and think for a moment about the years that have passed. And stop and think for a moment about where you get your news. Now, I could have opened this morning with the fact that the Epstein files have been released, sort of. I could have opened with the fact that a Russian general was blown up in Moscow. I could have opened this morning with a full discussion of the implications of what we are doing in Venezuela. I could have opened this morning by talking about the continuing urgency of the Middle East crisis. There are 1,000,001 subjects which we could have discussed this morning on Around the Political World with John Rothman. But I am focusing, my friends, on what I think is perhaps the most important story of all. The fact that the Trump administration is trying to control the news. Now, I know that there are some who will say every administration tries to control the news. And to an extent, that's correct. But we have never seen such blatant attacks on independent news sources, including what Donald Trump is doing now with the BBC. The British Broadcasting Corporation is now threatened with a $10 billion lawsuit by Donald Trump because he claims that in their coverage of January 6th, they edited his remarks in such a fashion as to be pejorative. Media is essential in our lives. Now, some people ask me, well, how many people really listen to the radio? How many people really listen to network television? Not as many as used to, because now we have the internet, which you all know is so accurate in everything that is reported. We now have the ability to turn on our computers. Interestingly enough, somebody asked me the question, John, you use your computer every day, don't you? And I said, yes, I do. But not in the middle of the night, I said. In the middle of the night, I reach for my radio. Because when I get the hourly news on CBS, I know what I'm getting is who, what, when, where, why, how. I'm not getting editorial opinion. Quite the contrary, when I turn on some of the right-of-center news sources, including Fox and Newsmax, when I turn on those sources in order to learn more about the news, what I get, frankly, is biased reporting. And you see it every single day. In fact, I've told the story before that I was at a dinner party some years ago, and a woman who insisted on sitting next to me decided to enlighten me on her views. Now, the problem was that before I got to the dinner party, I had been listening to a right-wing broadcast by Sean Hannity. And when I sat down, and this woman immediately approached me, and I was seated next to her during the entire dinner, she proceeded to recite for me, essentially, Sean Hannity's podcast, or his broadcast, rather. And I looked at her and I said, when you were coming down, you were listening to Sean Hannity. And she said, how did you know? That's the simple reality of the world we live in. And when 60 Minutes can be forced at the last minute, or chooses at the last minute to change one of its segments, when a threat is made to take over CBS, when major networks, including NBC and ABC and CBS, settle lawsuits over what they broadcast with the Trump administration, rather than pursuing these matters in court, every single one of us should be scared. Now, it's true that I could have this morning decided to speak about any number of subjects. But for me, this is the most important, because it has to do with where you and I get our news. And what am I really reflecting on every morning with you on Around the Political World with John Rothman? I'm reflecting on the stories that move me, that I hope will move you. And of course, it is one man's opinion. That's all it is. Just my views and the things that I choose to emphasize. But there is no doubt that we are all influenced by the news, by what happens every single day. I have people who tell me, I no longer listen to the news. I no longer read newspapers. I don't want to know what's going on. It upsets me too much. Well, the whole point of what I'm doing with you today is to say we should be upset. It's interesting to note that during World War II, in its aftermath, a poll was taken. Where did most people get their news? Over 80% responded they got their news from radio. And I grew up as a creature of radio. I love listening to the news on the radio. So when I tuned in for the Week in Review on the CBS radio network, and they began their announcements this week by announcing this would be the last broadcast of that program, it set off alarm bells. And when 60 Minutes changed its segment, it set off alarm bells. And when the head of the FCC talks about the fact that they are not an independent agency, but rather work for the federal government, all of a sudden, all of the fears that I have were manifest, not just on one level, but on every level. If you have ever listened to this podcast before, you know that we always end it with a hope that you will convey this episode to a friend or a colleague so we can continue to grow and expand. I say to you today, if ever there was a segment that ought to be forwarded to your friends and colleagues, it is this segment. Why? Because my ability to do my job, your ability to think, to reason, to respond, is completely contingent on access to information. And if major networks, whether on radio or on television, can be intimidated to not give us the news or to restrict the news, we're in big trouble. Don't you agree? Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Around the Political World with John Rothman. I'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. You can write a review on Apple Podcasts, drop a comment or two on YouTube or Spotify. Click any of the links in the show notes to connect with me on social media. Remember, please, and I emphasize this, to share this episode with a friend or colleague so we can continue to grow and expand. You know that the show has been getting so much positive attention that we've been very excited to bring on advertising support. And we believe this will help create more opportunities for Around the Political World. And to Gogo Zoger, the wonderful producer of this podcast, thanks, Gogo, for everything you do to make sure that Around the Political World with John Rothman gets up and running. And to all of you, I'll be back tomorrow, right here, with another episode of Around the Political World with John Rothman. See you then.
Happy holidays! Want to give your host a gift? Consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing the show this holiday season. It really helps the show grow. From all of us at Believe, have a Merry Christmas, everyone, and a Happy Holiday. If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.